So I guess let's hit that first real quick because we are coming up on our 2 hours. So internal conflict in conflict resolution. The lack of adequate conflict resolution and restorative justice processes isn't unique to the Green Party or the left, right? Especially restorative justice. This is a social, a society-wide problem that we don't have restorative justice as a, processes in place. So, things we're talking about are things like mediation and nonviolent communication. The Green Party likes consensus decision making, and they can help diffuse tension by including more voices, but they can also be abused without effective facilitation and good faith engagement. There's often unwritten rules that are only known by some and are selectively enforced. It's really essential to have clear rules and processes, and it, this is something that I want to emphasize that you can set up your own conflict resolution stuff, you can set up your own processes, but this is something where the broader party really needs to step up. It's hard to solve your own problems if you're all involved, right? How do you, and the same goes for like facilitators, right? How do you have objective voices to help you work through this stuff? Because one of the worst things you can do is go into conflict resolution with biased people in control or with biased processes, right? When that happens, you're not actually resolving the conflict. You're deepening it and generally pushing someone out, as opposed to solving the conflict. Um, and I will say, if it was about 10% of people, I think, identified internal conflict as one of the main problems in their party. From my experience in the Green Party, that number is way higher. Where we in my experience in the Green Party, interpersonal conflict is one of the biggest problems we have in organizing. So I think it was a little bit underreported. And I think one of the big reasons one of the bigger problems that we have is because when it happens, there's often no clear path to resolution, right? When someone does, run afoul of green values, like what does restorative justice look like? What are restorative processes look like? Most states don't have anything like that. Most states don't have anything in terms of discipline, right, in their bylaws. In Illinois, where I'm from, we can remove a member, but there's no restorative process. It would have to be made up on the fly, which is not a healthy way to deal with that situation. This is the National Party has a dispute resolution committee, but I don't think we should even pretend that exists. It's not binding. People can just refuse to participate. The people in charge of it actually don't have any training or skills for the most part in conflict mediation. And it's largely failed in its role. So I think we need to be looking at building something new because what we have is working. But, conflict can be kind of the greatest source of growth, right? And innovation, but it's got to be managed properly. It's got to be moved through processes that are clear. It's got to be handled well. Otherwise, it can be one of the most destructive things that we can face.
This might actually be a place where maybe some better terminology might even help. I have one book that I always think of the title because the title really summarizes a really good key point, and it's conflict is not abuse. And I think that's kind of what's applying to what Chris is saying here, that conflict on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. And actually, conflict in the sense of a civil disagreement, right, is very important for party growth because that's where we challenge each other to do better. And that's where we challenge our ideas and we say, has this idea been working for us? And if not, how can we change it? How can we make it better? How can we do what we need to grow the party? So we're not necessarily trying to stifle conflict here. We're not stifling free speech or anything like that. What we're talking about is dealing with when the conflicts get so great that it becomes abusive, that there becomes harm being done to somebody, where we really need to step in and prevent that. Because we need to have safe spaces for our members, right, where folks can feel comfortable actually expressing their opinions and expressing their thoughts and their personal experiences and stuff like this. And if they don't feel safe to do that, if they feel like someone's going to jump down their throat and attack them and then there's no consequences, then they're not going to open up. And if they don't open up, they never really feel part of the party and they eventually drift away. So, this is a really important thing for growing and maintaining our local parties. And I want to throw in there that point about unwritten rules, especially that it's important to write down processes up front, so that folks know how to follow it and to implement it, but also so that it can be more fair. You can have a process that we apply fairly to everybody. And then you kind of have a documentation, a record that it's, the same sort of process was applied to everybody. You weren't treating someone preferentially or whatever. And that's what happens when you don't have rules written down. You don't have rules written down, or the rules are really unclear. Then everyone has to kind of interpret it or kind of make something up on the spot. And everyone's going to have a different idea. And then you start to create more conflict, actually, because then everyone has a different interpretation of what should be done or not be done. And then you start getting accusations thrown around. They're like, oh, you're being biased, or you're whatever, you're not following the rules. You're not following the bylaws and all. And it starts to become a, its own source of conflict, ironically. So it's good to have a very clear process up front before there's any sort of internal conflict that everyone's aware of and that everyone knows how to participate in. Go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
Oh, yeah. And, while this is vital for, our internal work, right? If we're having these problems as Greens, right, as all self-identifying Greens, people who are generally coming from at least somewhat of the same space politically, right? If we're having that problem within our narrow, ideological outlook, what's that mean for us when we're talking about building a mass party, when we're talking engaging the mass working class, the mass of non-voters, right? And the massive range of ideas and perspectives and, positive or negative that come with that, right? If we can't deal with it, if we can't find out a way to effectively deal with this kind of conflict and how to successfully navigate and turn conflict into growth within our small, narrow demographics, how can we ever expect to do it on the larger scale, right? So while this, seems like it's kind of a case by case, like interpersonal thing, which often is how it manifests, right? It has this kind of existential importance to us. If we can't figure out how to navigate this, we will never grow. When I first got involved in the Young Eco-Socialist, which is the youth caucus, you can check them out at yesgp.org. If you're under 35, join them. They're a great space. When I first got involved with them, I started running an education program, which anyone who knows me is what I do when I burn out. I switched to education. But so I started running an education program, and one of the things that we wanted to do that we didn't succeed on because we didn't really get buy-in from our leadership and our membership at the time was we wanted a facilitator training program, right? Which kind of gets into a couple slides from now. But our goal was to train hundreds of young socialist facilitators to help navigate these problems of growth, right? To help navigate conflict. It's funny because, looking back a few years later, some of the people who are most opposed to us doing such a system because they didn't quite get it and they didn't get why we wanted to do it came back around and were like, oh, things would be so much different if we had done that. So it can be really important, but we'll get to facilitation in a minute.